A couple of years ago, I thought I had a pretty good idea what the next chapter of my life was going to look like. I had worked most of my life. I was used to solving problems. I was used to being the person who could figure things out, get things done, and keep moving. And then my body started changing the rules. Not all at once, but enough that the future I had pictured started looking very different. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because if you're over 50 and something has happened that you didn't plan for, maybe it's your health, maybe it's your job, maybe retirement isn't looking the way you thought it would, maybe your finances changed, or maybe you've simply reached that point where you're looking at your life and thinking, okay, what now? This isn't really a video about illness, and it's definitely not medical advice. It's about what happens when life forces you to start over at an age when you thought you'd finally have a few things figured out. And I've learned a few things about that. For most of my working life, being useful was a big part of how I saw myself. If something needed fixing, you fixed it. If there was a problem, you figured it out. If people were depending on you, you showed up. And when you've lived that way for decades, you start assuming your body is going to cooperate. You don't really think about it. You just get up and go until one day you can't quite do that anymore. And for me, one of the hardest parts wasn't just the physical change, it was what that change did to the picture I had in my head of the future. Because suddenly there were questions I hadn't expected to be asking yet. What happens if I can't work the way I used to? What happens if my energy isn't predictable? What can I still build? What can I still contribute? And maybe the biggest one, who am I if I can't do what I used to do? I think that's something we don't talk about enough when we talk about starting over after 50. People make it sound exciting. Reinvent yourself. Start your second act. Follow your passion. Build the life you've always wanted. And sometimes that's exactly what happens. But sometimes starting over isn't something you chose. Sometimes life chooses it for you. There's no inspirational music playing in the background. You're just sitting there realizing the old plan isn't going to work anymore. So now what? The first thing I've learned is this: strength can look very different than I thought it did. For most of my life, strength meant pushing through. Keep going, don't quit, finish the job, solve the problem. But there are situations where pushing harder isn't strength. Sometimes strength is saying, I can't do that today. Sometimes it's asking for help. Sometimes it's changing the plan. Sometimes it's admitting that you're tired. And sometimes it's accepting that the version of you who could do everything 10 years ago isn't the standard you have to keep measuring yourself against. That was not an easy lesson for me. I'm still learning it. The second thing I've learned is that rest isn't the same thing as failure. That's a tough one when you've spent decades being productive. You can be sitting down because your body genuinely needs it, and your mind is still standing there with a clipboard telling you everything you should be doing. I should be working. I should be accomplishing something. I should be further ahead. I should be able to handle this. But eventually, I started asking a different question. Instead of, what should I be able to do? I started asking, what can I realistically do with the energy I have today? That's a very different way of looking at life. And strangely enough, it doesn't mean giving up. It actually makes it easier to keep going because you're no longer spending half your energy fighting yourself. The third thing I've learned is probably the reason this YouTube channel exists. Purpose doesn't disappear just because your capacity changes. It may have to change shape. That's different. When I realized the old path wasn't going to work the same way anymore, I started looking for another option. That's eventually what led me deeper into digital tools, AI, creating things online, learning skills I never expected to be learning at this stage of my life. And eventually, earnable skills grew out of that, not because I suddenly became some sort of tech expert. I didn't. I started because I needed to know whether there were useful things I could still learn and useful things I could still build, even if I had to do them differently. That's why I'm so interested in helping people over 50 start with the knowledge and experience they already have, because I don't believe starting over means starting from zero. You still have decades of experience. You still know things. You've solved problems. You've learned lessons. You've lived a life. The question becomes, how do I use what I still have instead of spending all my time mourning what changed? And I don't mean that in a cold, just get over it kind of way, because there is grief when life changes. There absolutely is. I'm talking about allowing grief to exist without letting it write the rest of the story. And that leads to the fourth thing I've learned. Starting over doesn't always mean rebuilding your old life. I think I spent a long time assuming success meant getting back to where I was, back to the same strength, the same capacity, the same plans, the same version of normal. But what if the next chapter isn't supposed to be an exact reconstruction of the last one? What if it's smaller in some ways, but deeper in others? What if you work differently, learn differently, contribute differently? Maybe your world gets a little smaller, but the things inside it start mattering more. I don't think we talk about that enough, especially for people over 50, because we're surrounded by messages telling us that if we're not growing bigger, moving faster, earning more, or doing more, we're falling behind. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. And somewhere in the middle of thinking about all of this, something happened that I definitely hadn't planned. I wrote a book that still feels a little strange to say. It's called Still Held. The full title is Still Held: Finding Strength, Purpose, and Peace When Your Body Can't Do What It Once Did. And it's a Christian devotional. I didn't originally sit down thinking, I'm going to write a book. It really grew out of the questions I've been talking about today. Who am I when I can't do what I used to do? What happens to purpose when life gets smaller? How do you rest without feeling guilty? What happens to faith when the answer you hope for doesn't come? And how do you keep moving forward when you don't really know what the future looks like? Those questions became 10 reflections. Each chapter also has reflection questions and a short prayer. And I'm not going to turn this video into a big sales pitch for it. That's not why most of you came to Earnable Skills. But I wanted to tell you about it because, in a strange way, this book and this channel came out of the same place. They're just answering different parts of the question. Earnable Skills asks, what can I still learn, build, and create when life changes after 50? Still Held asks, how do I make peace with myself, my faith, and the life I'm actually living while I figure that out? And for me, those two questions are connected. So if your life looks different today than you thought it would, I want to leave you with this. You do not need the entire next chapter figured out. I certainly don't. Maybe you just need the next step, one skill, one conversation, one new idea, one thing you can build, one thing you finally give yourself permission to stop doing. Maybe you're not rebuilding the life you had. Maybe you're building another option, and that option doesn't have to look impressive to anyone else. It just has to move you forward. If Still Held sounds like something that could help you, or maybe someone you know who is dealing with chronic illness or a season of major change, I'll leave information about the book below. But whether you ever read it or not, I hope you remember this. Your circumstances may have changed. Your capacity may have changed. Your plans may have changed. But that does not mean your useful years are behind you. It does not mean you have nothing left to contribute. And it definitely doesn't mean it's too late to build another option. I'm Carl. This is Earnable Skills. And if you're trying to figure out what your next chapter looks like after 50, you're in the right place. I'll see you in the next video.